Hello and welcome to Ratio Christi Television. What are logical fallacies? How often do people make them? And how should we as Christians be thinking about and be informed about logical fallacies so we can spot them when people make them, which is a very common occurrence? And how can we respond to those as well? That's what I'll be talking to my next guest about in this episode. Ratio Christi is a campus apologetics alliance. We set up Christian apologetics clubs on university, college, community college, and high school campuses throughout the United States and internationally as well. We've been around for a number of years now, focusing on college students, but Ratio Christi College Prep, RCCP, was started just a couple of years ago to reach these high schoolers who are getting to college and not knowing what they're going to face. 50 to 80% of church-going youth leave the church after high school or by the time they're 22 years old. Through Ratio Christi College Prep, or RCCP, we're preparing students for what they will face in college once they get there. Just go to ratiochristi.org, over to the top, click on RCCP, and you will find out more about that, where we happen to have chapters right now and how you can help get a chapter started at your local high school, homeschool co-op, or any other group around that level, local YMCA, wherever you happen to meet. So just go to our website. You'll be able to find out more about that. The purpose of our organization is helping people aware of the evidence for the Christian worldview and to point people to truth with a capital T, which is why we call our program Truth Matters. Joining me is Anna Kitko. Anna was made providentially aware of her calling into Christian apologetics in high school, having been caught up in ministering to local destructive cult groups. She has fully embraced this calling and now has 3 university degrees in the field. Anna adores enriching and growing the church through the teaching and equipping of others to be able to better understand and articulate their faith, and making people more comfortable discussing uncomfortable topics, because those can be some of the most important conversations that one ought to have. She has been here a number of times, so it's always a blessing to have her back for another new topic. Anna, welcome back to Truth Matters.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's great to be back.
You are here today to talk about logical fallacies. And Anna, this is a topic which is really even for non-Christians out there, because Christians, not as much if they study critical thinking and logic, but many non-Christians make logical fallacies all the time. People who follow different man-made religions make logical fallacies. But we have some viewers out there who are not even sure what those are. They've never taken a class on logic or critical thinking, intro to philosophy, or any of that. So let's start off with that. What are logical fallacies?
Sure, absolutely. A fallacy is a flaw in an argument. So what this flaw usually does is make a bad argument appear to be good or more persuasive, or is a simple mistake in reasoning, meaning that the argument's premises fail to establish a necessary conclusion. Fallacies in general are divided into 2 subgroups called formal and informal. From there, they break down into other subgroups like valid or sound, invalid, deductive or inductive, strong or weak, cogent. You get the idea. Depending upon which group a fallacy falls under determines which type of fallacy has occurred. So that's what we're talking about tonight.
And Anna, I know that you actually had an app that you created on logical fallacies. I do want to point our viewers that way. To get that app, they can have on their Apple or Android device. This will help you think critically on the go. And we also want to point you to, the fact that there are many books out there on logic and critical thinking, because we can't give you enough in this 28-minute episode that people need. This is such an important topic that people need to be aware of. Now, when we talk about fallacies in logic, is there a difference between being reasonable and being logical?
Sure, and these terms get confused and conflated all the time. So vocabulary terms in formal logic are often misunderstood or used interchangeably in our culture, so it's easy for definitions to become muddied or less distinct. So in your question, the distinction would be that reasonableness occurs when I'm successful at following how you are going about reasoning through a problem or scenario. Whether or not you're being logical in your reasoning is beside the point. The sheer fact that I'm following your thought process makes you reasonable to me. On the other hand, being logical requires that you submit your own thoughts or arguments successfully to the criteria or rules that govern formal logic. So these are rules like the law of identity or the law of non-contradiction, if you've ever heard those, the law of excluded middle. These are examples of being logical. So one is just following reasoning. The other one is subjecting yourself to universal standards.
And we definitely want to help people be aware that all these different terms that we're using in these different categories within logic and critical thinking. We talk about fallacies, formal, informal, again, being reasonable, the distinction between that and being logical. And when we put together arguments, a lot of people, they make statements, and many times they don't realize that you can actually break that statement down into a syllogism, an actual argument, which can be sound or unsound, valid, etc. Let's get into that a little bit more here. So what makes a thought deductive versus inductive?
Good, great question. So a deductive argument is something that's determined by what we've already discussed, namely the argument claims that it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. So like for you, for what you just brought up, a syllogism, that's usually two premises followed by a conclusion. So what the deductive argument will say is if the premises are true, then it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. And so when you're determining validity or invalidity, soundness or unsoundness, then you are dealing with what is a deductive argument. Conversely, an inductive argument is made when an argument is merely asserting a conclusion of probability. Okay, meaning that the conclusion is not necessitated by the premises, but is merely likely that the conclusion is true based upon what you've already set up in your argument. If an inductive argument is identified as having a conclusion that's probably true based on the premises, then that argument is said to just be strong. Okay, if an inductive argument's conclusion is not probably true based on the premises, then it's said to be weak. This is when you start to see those distinctions come out. Deductive arguments are made from like big picture perspectives down to small conclusions, whereas inductive arguments are usually made from experience. So for a deductive argument, think of the infamous bachelor argument, right? All bachelors are unmarried men. John is a bachelor, therefore John is an unmarried man. We have a universal principle. All bachelors are unmarried. We have a specific example, John. He is also a bachelor, therefore John's an unmarried man. It's impossible for John to be a bachelor and not an unmarried man. That's a deductive argument. For an inductive argument, you want to think something like you're walking in the park next to a lake, and I say to you, that swan over there is white. All swans that I've seen have been white, therefore all swans are white. What I'm doing is taking my personal experience, which is very limited. I'm taking a very specific example, and then I'm extrapolating from that limited experience a universal claim. That's an inductive argument, and it's considered weak. You don't really want to focus on inductive arguments. You want to always use deductive ones.
And when it comes to the types of logical fallacies, can you define different types for our viewers?
Sure. Yeah, there are formal fallacies and informal fallacies. So a formal fallacy occurs when the form of an argument is identified as flawed, regardless of the argument's content. Okay, we're just looking at the form. There are certain argument forms that are made on a regular basis that have been identified through history by logicians as forms that are always considered valid or always strong versus forms that are always weak or invalid. So let's take, for example, that bachelor example that I used earlier. And just trade up some of the vocabulary terms. If I say all bachelors are unmarried men, John is an unmarried man, therefore John is a bachelor, we have a problem because I just switched two of the terms around, right? Just because John's unmarried doesn't mean he's a bachelor. He could be dating somebody, he could have a fiance. When we look at the form, we see something like all A are B, all C are B, and then somebody trying to conclude that all A are C. That form will never work out to be a strong argument. So that form is usually mentioned as fallacious. Okay, informal fallacies, on the other hand, are there are arguments that you have to understand the content for. You have to have some background knowledge. So you may have heard people discuss things like ad hominem arguments or bandwagoneering. And these are the types of fallacies that you have to study in and of themselves in order to identify them in practice. Those are informal fallacies.
And the informal fallacies are something that everyone should be familiar with, because when you are familiar with them, you start to spot very quickly how often these logical fallacies are made. If you regularly watch the news, if you read the newspaper, even if you watch commercials on TV, you will start
Right.
to notice fallacies that are made all the time. And I'm telling you, the society that we live in today, we need more critical thinking. We need people who know what fallacies are, logic, formal and informal fallacies, to let our viewers know about some of these informal fallacies in particular. Can you let them know some of the common the names that we use, define some of those, give some examples for those?
Sure. These arguments are the ones that you usually hear in Latin, or somebody brings up, that they're in philosophy classes and they're like, oh, that's an ad hominem argument. And you're kind of like, what's that? So examples of these would be argumentum ad baculum, which in Latin is appeal to the stick. It's usually a reference to being forced to an intellectual conclusion via a threat of physical harm. Okay, so imagine yourself, you just got done with the Super Bowl, or you're at your local pub and you're rooting for whatever team you want, and the Yankees are playing, and the guy next to you says the Yankees are the best team in the league, and if you don't believe me, I've got two fists that say you will. That's argumentum ad baculum, right? He's making an argument, a rather persuasive one for some people, that says you're going to agree with the conclusion that I've just given you because I'm physically threatening you. It's not a good argument, right? It's fallacious reasoning. It doesn't actually give you a good reason to believe that the Yankees are the best team in the league. It just kind of scares you into concluding that, yeah, okay, I'm going to agree with you because I'm scared of you. Another one would be argumentum ad populum, or appeal to the people, which is a reference to appealing to a population's feeling of wanting to be loved or appreciated or valued. Think an emotionally driven argument. There's not a whole lot of content there. It's more of just your feelings on the subject. It can also be appealing to populations' suspicions or fears. So you see this the most common in like propaganda posters. And then, of course, if you are a philosophy student or if you're in one of my classes, then you will assess Adolf Hitler's speeches, because he was a master at using this particular type of fallacious reasoning. It helped manipulate a lot of people to follow him. Another one would be argumentum ad ignorantium, which is an appeal to ignorance. Another common one that you see, this is when there's an assertion made based entirely upon the basis that little is known about a subject in question, and then a concrete conclusion is formed on that basis of a lack of information. Okay, so you see this in like your apologetics courses, right? Where you're talking to, maybe you're out on the street and you're speaking to an atheist or an agnostic, and they say something like, no one can prove for sure that a higher being exists, therefore it's true that a higher being exists, or something along those lines. And it doesn't always have to be phrased that way, but that's the core of the argument. That's an argumentum ad ignorantium. They're literally basing their position on a lack of evidence. These are the kinds of things that you would see studying informal fallacies.
Now, what are the most common logical fallacies committed in your experience of talking with people, reading works by atheists, agnostics, people who follow different man-made religions, and all of that?
Probably in my experience, it would be the red herring fallacy when you're dealing with social media or watching the news in general. And then there's what's called tu quoque, which is a very specific form of an ad hominem argument. An ad hominem argument is somebody that, an argument that's made to attack the character of a person who is debating you or arguing for you. There's different types. Tu quoque is what happens when an argument calls attention to some hypocritical aspect to the arguer that's making the claim. So In this type of fallacy, the first arguer will make a claim to which a second arguer discredits the first by calling attention to the notion that the first person has committed the same action that he or she is wishing to discredit. So think hypocrisy, people making arguments towards hypocrisy. You see this happen a lot when someone makes a value judgment on whether or not an action is bad. So think the high school student that comes home, you've caught him skipping class, and you say to them, "Hey, son, you can't skip class. That's bad." And he says in return, "You can't tell me that I shouldn't skip class because I know for a fact that you skipped class when you were my age." That's a two-OK argument. There's no substance there trying to discredit the notion that skipping class is bad, right? That subject matter isn't even glossed over. All they do is point at you and say, "Well, you're a hypocrite. You have no way of making that value judgment," which doesn't actually deal with the judgment itself, which is why it's a fallacy. Then in the case of the red herring that I brought up earlier, this is what happens anytime an individual makes an argument and the response is to change the subject onto something else. So think about talking heads on TV. You turn your favorite news program and the broadcast has folks arguing back and forth and back and forth. And then one individual actually makes a claim, right? We'll call that claim X, to which the response by another individual is to be, "Well, but what about Y and Z over here instead?" That's called the red herring fallacy. And that's when you are desperately trying to change the subject onto other matter and not actually dealing with what was brought up or the argument at hand. Those two, I think I see the most often.
And speaking of the former that you mentioned there, Tukokwe, Anna, that is one that we hear all the time nowadays when we bring up the violence in the Quran and the life of Muhammad. And people say, "Oh, yeah, but well, look at the Old Testament. There's violence in there, too." If they don't understand the context of this, this is the only reason why this logical fallacy continues to be made, this informal fallacy. People don't realize the difference between the Old Testament violence and the New Testament teachings of Christ. And it's the opposite with the Quran. The peaceful verses came earlier in the life of Muhammad. The more violent, aggressive, militaristic, political, etc., verses came later in the life of Muhammad. So it's totally apples and oranges here to compare New Testament commands from Jesus to the Medina verses of the Quran referring to Muhammad after he gained power, gained followers, and all of that. So a very common one when it comes to Christianity and Islam and that whole conversation, which continues to happen nowadays. But why do we need to know the difference between a logical and being logically fallacious?
Because we make decisions about what is and is not true every day, right? This is how we live, whether we identify it or not. We make value judgments that dictate the direction our life goes, how we raise our children, what we eat for breakfast. All of the choices we make are contingent on these things. So whether we acknowledge it or not, we'll carry with us a personal philosophy that guides how we view the world and ourselves in it. At the end of the day, knowing the difference between being logical and being fallacious is what identifies the greater question of what is true. So when someone makes an argument, for example, that there are no absolutes, which is something we hear all the time. I know here at Ratio Christi and on campus, I hear that probably every day. We have the tools to test whether or not that argument, because it is an argument, right? It's a truth claim, is fallacious. And we can conclude with the tools that we have that it is. Because to say, just in general, there are no absolutes is itself to make an absolute statement. So they're saying there are no absolutes, and then they're making an absolute statement in so doing, and that makes the original argument self-defeating. We can dismiss it on that basis alone. We don't have to sit there and tease it out longer. It's kind of like what we were studying before with the forms. The form of the argument itself is invalid. We're supposed to reject that form automatically if we are trying to be logical. But, just because, a logic teacher says that's not logical, you need to go back and make sure that, I know what I'm talking about and that you can see the rules of logic, where they come from, that they're universal, that we're all subject to them. And then test the truth claims of different people against those laws. So like the truth claims that Muhammad makes, test him, find out, are any of his arguments in poor form? Are any of his arguments unsound? Look at our great teacher, Jesus Christ, when he says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. That's a claim. We can test that. And sure enough, when we look at the scriptures and we look at the manuscript evidence and we start pulling the miracles that he did and the divinity that he claimed, he is backed up with sound arguments. Not only is he validly representing himself, but his truth claims are actually true in reality. That makes his arguments valid and sound. That's the strongest argument form you can have as an individual. This is why this stuff is important, not only to teach, but also to test ourselves, because at the end of the day, who wants to be thinking fallaciously? I know I don't. I know that my students don't. So let's get better at understanding these rules and continue to subject ourselves humbly to them.
Logic, these formal and informal fallacies that you're talking about, critical thinking, the basic laws of logic, law of identity, law of excluded middle, law of non-contradiction, all of these things come into play when we're talking about the different worldviews that are out there: Christianity, Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Hinduism, Buddhism, the list goes on. These all make exclusive truth claims about reality, and they're completely in contradiction to one another, which lets us know they can't, it's logically impossible for them to all be true. It is possible that everyone is wrong, but they can't all be true. And if one is right, all the other ones are automatically false. And Christianity is what has the most evidence behind it. That doesn't actually make it true, just saying, oh, there's more evidence for this. But it actually corresponds to reality when we look at the history of the entire world. That lines up with the Judeo-Christian worldview. It lines up with the Bible, which is actual history, and of course prophecy fulfilled, and talks about a future time as well. And it's never been incorrect in anything. There's so many factors that back up the Christian worldview, so much evidence for it. And this whole topic of logic, critical thinking, and all of that, it just goes hand in hand, and it actually helps to back it up even more when we think critically about this stuff. Now, how can we keep from committing fallacies of thought ourselves?
Obviously, educating yourself is a big one, and that can be hard to do sometimes. I know with studying formal logic back when I got started, it was a necessary part of a philosophy degree. You could not graduate without taking not only a formal logic course, but also a symbolic logic course, which is the analyzing those forms like all A or B, all B or C, therefore all A or C. There are tons of those different forms, and you would actually have to take and assess those forms and memorize them, be able to articulate them in real time. Nowadays, I have philosophy students that have never had to take a logic class at all. So finding a logic course like Ratio Christi's Logic Project, or like the app, or something along those lines is crucial. Definitely educate yourself. And it's not just because we want to get this information out there, it's because this will actually be used. And it's fun. I don't know how many times you've watched, a presidential speech, or had to assess a case, or even in apologetics, you're practicing critical reasoning and formal logic on a regular basis, and this is something we're commanded to do from Scripture. So educating yourself is absolutely crucial, and we'll do our best, especially here at Ratio Christi, to make sure that we can provide those tools to you, and practice. Practicing is absolutely crucial as well, because it's hard to think in formal logic lines or along those lines unless you're practiced at it. It gets easier, but you want to make sure that as you're speaking to people, that you are speaking in terms that are valid actually, and are sound actually, and that takes practice. Stay humble, understand that your interlocutor, or the person that you're speaking to, that you're arguing with, that you recognize that they're not necessarily going to be thinking in a perfectly formal form all the time. But with practice, you really can, and it's wonderful when it comes to being persuasive, right? Because proof is different than persuasion. I can sit here and prove something logically, but you may not be persuaded by it. If I can take proof and demonstrate that it's true, that's the best way to persuade people towards whatever end you're going after. And in our case, with Christian apologetics, demonstrating via logic the fact that Jesus Christ is the truth, and he always has been.
And the sad part about this, Anna, is that about a century or so ago, these laws of logic used to be taught to elementary students.
Yeah.
Nowadays, you have to get to community college and then choose to take a class in critical thinking or intro to philosophy in order to get this stuff. So we have viewers out there who want to get their hands on more of this. And of course, there are many books out there talking about logic, critical thinking, and all of this, which again is so helpful, whether you're a Christian or not. But as a Christian and wanting to think critically about why we believe what we believe, what are some books that you would recommend to our viewers out there to look to get more of this stuff, more explanations about fallacies, maybe give them some examples, give them some chances to do some stuff on their own as they learn. They learn the different fallacies, informal, formal, and what are some good resources that to point people to get more of this?
My highest recommendation is to pick up an actual physical college textbook on logic. So you can find tons of them on Amazon. You can find them on eBay. Buy a used copy. Some of the newer versions have an actual DVD that will quiz you through content. But it's not that I expect you to sit there and read a textbook. It's that logic textbooks do break them down into sections. So if you need to review something specific, like what is an ad hominem argument exactly? What is an argument from authority? Did this person just make that argument? I can't quite tell. Is this bandwagoneering because I watched an ad and they said something along the lines of 95% of Americans already do this? Why aren't you? Is that bandwagoneering? The answer is yes. That's a lot of ad campaigns do that actually. But just being able to clarify your thoughts and being able to test what you know. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you can articulate what these are called in Latin, totally unnecessary, but just so that you can clarify how you are reasoning and where you are making failures yourself, you can then apply it to other people. And remember to do so kindly. Try not to beat them over the head with it, but it's very crucial to do so. So yeah, pick up a textbook. It's the best way to do it. It's all laid out. People like me have worked very hard to make it look that way. So go for it and study, study, study.
Excellent. Anna, it's always a blessing to have you here. Thank you so much for informing our audience on this very vital topic of logic and critical thinking. And of course, all these different fallacies, formal, informal, and all your explanations throughout this episode. Thank you so much for all your great work with Ratio Christi over there in Tennessee.
You are more than welcome. Thank you.
Friends, we need to think about critical thinking. We need to think about logic. And like I said, this is so underrated nowadays, it seems. You look at society the way that it is, there is not enough critical thinking going on. Even if you read some of these sources, you don't have to feel like you have to go out and start talking about critical thinking or talking about logic, but knowing how to think critically and knowing logic and logical fallacies and how to help you not commit them and all of that, just thinking about this will be so much help in your life as well as the lives of people around you. Please visit ratiochristi.org and find out more about how you can pray for us and support this ministry financially. Remember, when it comes to what we believe and why we believe it, truth matters.